Despite the realignment, the Big Ten remains on brand. What you can look forward to in terms of rankings this season and what matchups will be the most compelling with this new look in conference realignment. This is the College Game Day podcast for Wednesday, May 29th. Rece Davis with you. Pete Thamel is on assignment. Pete Thamel is working sources at the SEC meetings in the glorious panhandle of Florida. He will come with all kinds of information over the next calendar year as a result of the interactions had, perhaps at Sandestin or wherever it is, whichever hotel or luxurious estate they are now holding those festivities in the greater 30A neighborhood. But we are delighted to be joined by Ryan McGee and Bill Connelly on this edition of the podcast. So first of all, Bill, I don't know if you recognize this, but you and I are graced by McGee's presence. His first media obligation since he went all in on race day. He was in his racing glory recently. Ryan, how was the trip? How was the back and forth, Indy, Charlotte, all of that?
It was good. I chased Kyle Larson, and we were started in Indianapolis, ended up in Charlotte. We sat in the rain in Indianapolis. Then got on a plane and went to Charlotte, flew through the rain that we had just gotten rained on, and then got to Charlotte just in time to get rained on by the same rain again. So I tell you this, I did the Indy-Charlotte double with Tony Stewart 20 years ago, with Robbie Gordon like 25 years ago. It's like red-eye flights and drinking games. That's a young man's game, the double. So I'm not sure if we'll be doing that again. But Rece, racing is my – That's been my deal for a long time, so it's good to be back at the racetrack.
Bill, are you a race fan at all? Do you follow the races?
I know who wins the races. I don't spend my Saturdays or Sundays keeping up with it. Once football's over, I mean, other than soccer in the morning, which fits into my schedule perfectly. I try to hand over the remote to other people in the household as much as possible. It just makes everything a lot easier come fall.
I don't want to offend my friends in the racing community. As Ryan knows, Ryan and I actually became very good friends early in my tenure at ESPN when I was the host of a show called RPM Tonight. And when they called me and asked me to host the show, I said to the executive who called me, I said, if you think, hey, let's get the guy from Alabama to host the racing show, I said, you've got the wrong dude. I said, I don't know anything about it. I said, I have a functional literacy of who Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon are. I said, and they were, oh, no. I said, now I'll learn it. And Ryan was instrumental in helping me learn it. I developed an intense appreciation, but not a passion for it. Once I finished RPM Tonight, I've rarely watched a race from start to finish. But during that time, I think it's that way in our business with just about any sport you're assigned to cover, that you develop often an appreciation for it and what those guys do and the teamwork it takes and the technology involved and the intensity in the arena or at the racetrack is impressive, whether you are Ryan McGee, hardcore lifelong race fan, or Rece Davis, who was thrown into it in my early 30s or whatever. I guess I was 31, 32 years old and, thrown into it and developed the appreciation for it when you go. And as a result of those early days in racing, I got to do some really cool things. I rode as a passenger in various race cars at tracks. And then Ryan, you'll know the track. What's the track in New Jersey? Is it Elizabethtown, the drag racing track?
Yeah. You went to NHRA. Yeah,
NHRA, and I drove a dragster.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, man, even though, very little could have gone wrong, one would think, right? But you're holding the clutch in, and when it's time to let it go, there's a big part of you, because you really haven't done this before, that goes, I don't think I want to let this go. So
it's like hitting off the first tee of Pro-Am. Suddenly, I'll play golf all the time, and then you realize it's a tunnel of people, and it's not exactly what you thought that it was. But I'll say this: what's changed tremendously, Rece, since you were there in the '90s, now is you walk up the pit lane. Like if you walked at the pit lane at the Coca-Cola 600 in Charlotte on Sunday night, so many college football players. It's crazy. Back when when you and I first met back in the 90s, you had what they call the over the belt gang. It's the guys who literally built the engines during the week and then just happened to pit the car over the weekends. Now, they started this guy named Ray Evernham and a guy named Andy Papa, who played offensive line at Stanford. In the 90s, they changed all that, and they started. So now you walk up down the pit lane, and it's guys that played at Appalachian State, and it's guys that played for Nick Saban at Alabama, it's guys that played at Georgia, guys that played at Georgia Southern. There's so many former college football players up and down the pit lane, and there's so much more crossover now even than there was back in the day. We did Marty McGee on Saturday morning from Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and Graham Rahal insists on being on Marty McGee every year because he is such a hardcore Ohio State fan that we want to talk to him about his dad and him trying to win the Indy 500. His dad was Bobby Rahal. He wants to talk to us about Ryan Day. He wanted to ask us about Quinshon Judkins, is he the real deal? We're like, yes. And so there's so much more crossover now, I feel like, than there used to be back in the day. But it's he looked at me and he goes, so here in Indiana, they're going to play UCLA this year. How do they feel about that? I'm like, I don't know. Let's ask. And so during the rain delay, I did.
Yeah. And so, Bill, that brings us perfectly to your latest SP Plus rankings, where the new Big Ten is on brand with the worst collection of offenses, perhaps bolstered by a very good collection of defenses. And I know you take a lot of that into consideration. Maybe a particular group of teams rank a certain place or have a certain rating in the SP Plus because of the teams they face, and some of that is because it's harder to move against Iowa than it is for Iowa. Iowa has a harder time moving on people. But as you evaluated this, the one thing that struck me as I read your article is dealing with the returning production and how you've had to tweak your formula, adjust your perception or your perspective or your formula going in based on, to use Ryan's example, Quinshon Judkins moving from Ole Miss to Ohio State, Dylan Gabriel moving from Oklahoma to Oregon. How has that impacted your belief in how accurate these will be in terms of projection in the early part of the season?
Over the last couple of years, I was a little shaky heading into the season just because, 2 years ago after USC did what USC did, bringing in not just a double-digit transfer haul, but bringing in like elite transfers who don't usually transfer, the Caleb Williamses of the world. I didn't feel like, I had a good way of accounting for that. And I didn't want to just start taking guesses as to how to account for that. I wanted there to be some data to lean on. But then I had data to lean on. And last year, I think it did pretty well as a whole. It nailed Colorado. That was kind of the one, do I have any sort of grasp on how to handle transfers? Well, how good is the Colorado projection? Well, they were projected to not be very good, and they pretty much landed exactly where they were supposed to, even with the start being the way it was. So I do feel like at this point there's just, I have had to tweak the weighting of the formula based on, how much of returning production matters. And when we say returning production, it's returning college production. At this point, it's not, how much of last year, how much of your team returns from last year. It really is more of a, when you bring in a transfer, his stats count for your totals and whatnot. And so I do think I've adjusted pretty well. When you look at this year's, the top of this year's SP Plus projections, it certainly seemed pretty conventional wisdom. Like there aren't many extreme leaps when you look at the teams at the top of the list. It's pretty much what people are when they put out the way too earlys. It's pretty similar to that. So, I like being antisocial. I like when I have some new names to throw out there or some team that is drastically overrated or whatever. But you look at the list, it makes quite a bit of sense. I got yelled at less for this year's list than I have for a while.
Do you pay attention? Because I have become oblivious largely to the yelling, and this comes from someone who by nature is a bit of a pleaser. I want people to get along. I want to be nice to people. I want people to be nice to me. But some of the yelling on occasion, and it's a minute fraction of fans who engage in this, but it's so irrational and illogical and hysterical that I've gotten to the point to, it's sort of like the old Lou Holtz joke that, he goes, he goes to a restaurant, and I don't know if this is completely true. It could be partially true, but he tells a story that he and his late wife, Beth, went out to dinner one night, and Notre Dame hadn't had a particularly good season. And the waiter says to him, "Hey, do you know the difference between Notre Dame and Cheerios?" And Lou says, "No, what?" And he goes, "Well, Cheerios belong in a bowl." And so Lou is steaming. Lou says, I'm steaming. I'm so angry. I can't even enjoy my dinner. And as Lou tells the story, his wife says to him, "Why is it that you would let someone who doesn't know you, doesn't care about you, doesn't think about you, have any impact on how you would enjoy your night or spending time with your family?" And Lou said that changed his perspective. So when the waiter came back over, Lou said to him, "Excuse me, do you know the difference between Lou Holtz and a golf pro?" And the waiter said, "No." And he goes, "Golf pro gives tips." So, so anyway, I've adopted a good portion of that philosophy in terms of this. I do want to take criticism into mind when it's reasonable and say, that's an interesting perspective. I'll evaluate that. But the hysterical, you hate my team, you're biased, all of this stuff. Bill Connelly, you're crazy for having whoever ranked in whatever spot. You deal with that pretty well.
I think basically it hints at your own insecurities, how personally you take it. Like if I make a genuine mistake in a piece and get yelled at for it, it does kind of hit because I screwed up. But if I'm confident in what I did, if I know I didn't screw up and it says what it's supposed to, then you do notice through the years it is playing the hits. It's just the fan base changes. One fan base loves you one year, then the exact same fan base hates you the next year, and you start to realize like this is all part of the dance, and you don't take it all that personally in the end.
Yeah, I had it happen last year with Florida State. The beginning of the year, I was right there with Chief Osceola. Then by the end, not so much. So
Washington. Washington was my version of that. When we do our little power ratings at the end of every Saturday night for ESPN.com, and I had Washington first like 2 weeks into the season, but then late in the year when they were winning every game by 2 points and their SP Plus rating started doing this, and they ended the regular season like 11th or something, Washington fans weren't quite as kind as they were when I was a visionary midway through September.
The Bill and I are always the ones, Rece. So our power rankings come in. And our playoff picks come in, all the ESPN writers and all that stuff. And Bill and I are always the ones that if there's one that everybody's mad about, typically he and I both have them in their top four, right? And this is the way the bottom 10 works, right? The part about the bottom 10 I didn't see coming when I took it over 10 years ago was the coveted fifth spot, which was not my idea. I inherited the idea, but it's not the fifth worst team in the country. But if you're Alabama and you're number one and you lose to Texas A&M, you're probably going to go in that spot for a week. And you can tell the fans of the teams that are always in the top 10 never read the bottom 10 because when they show up in the bottom 10, they don't quite get that at the airport. They explain to me that they don't quite understand what's going on.
Yeah. Hey, Bill, when you look at this now, you and I have had this discussion on the podcast too, and Ryan, I'm interested in your perspective on this as well. As we go into this 12-team playoff era, and Heather Dinich did a really nice piece the other day that I can envision. We did a similar thing on GameDay last week to try to explain how this is going to work. The difference between ranking and seeding, which is, I can imagine I'm going to say that 1 billion times leading into Selection Day. And as you get to this, the 12-team playoff, your rankings, the metrics that those and others, many other metrics that the selection committee has at its disposal that they will use to evaluate and rank these teams, it calls into question whether the committee is still useful. Now, last year and the first year, the playoff were the years that, in my judgment, the committee was useful because for the entire time of the BCS, people said, we have to have a human element. Well, you have to be able to distinguish between teams who, maybe don't have the exact same records, certainly do not have the exact same schedules, and determine which is stronger. And from your article, what was it? It's going to be the average top 5 team, which is, playoff team. And that will go a little farther down this year with the 12-team playoff. But the average top 5 team could be expected against the average SEC schedule to be less than a 10-win team. And then take the, Big 12 or ACC, I think you would expect an average top 5 team to be an 11-win team. And there are exceptions. Some of those schedules are tougher than others and all of that kind of thing. Where do you think this leaves the fans when it comes down to distinguishing between a 9-3 team from the Big 10 or the SEC versus a 10-2 team from the Big 12 or whatever?
Yeah, that's why I wanted to address it in that piece, because we've already kind of seen, even if it's just jokes about, an 8-4 SEC team versus an 11-1 ACC team, even if we're kind of exaggerating, we know what everybody's going to be yelling at in early December. And it's already been this way for a long time. And now we just added, Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC, and we created a genuine Power 2. Within the Power 4, I guess. Lots of new labels that we have to get used to. But yeah, I just wanted to, take these projections, which I know are as objective as anything can be, and use my strength of schedule ratings that I come up with, which is basically, I look at strength of schedule based on like, what would the average top 5 team expect to do against your schedule? Like Florida scheduled this year, the average top 5 team would go 9-3 against Florida's schedule. Just they play everybody in the top 15. Basically, they got the short straw by far from the SEC schedule makers, and that's going to skew some perceptions. Oklahoma's schedule is really, really, really hard. Missouri's isn't. Missouri's like 37th in strength of schedule this year. Ole Miss is in the 20s or 30s. I don't remember. But on average, so I just wanted to look at the averages, even though there's a range within each conference. And on average, yeah, the top 5, the average top 5 team would go about 10-2 against the average SEC schedule. It would win about 10.5 games against the average Big 10 schedule, because the Big 10 still has a lot of dead weight at the bottom, and it would go about 11-1 against the average ACC or Big 12 team. And I got yelled at for that, and you created a narrative and all this stuff after I put that out. But honestly, I was encouraged by that, because we know that it's going to be, SEC fans are not going to think their conference is one game better than whatever the ACC produces. They're going to think of their, they're going to think their 8-4 team deserves it over the crap schedule that the 11-1 ACC team faced. And this kind of set a bar, so to speak, that I was pretty okay with. So I basically used that in the SP Plus projections to just come up with a list of like sort of contenders, so to speak, like the teams that are most likely to go 10-2 in the SEC or the Big 10 or 11-1 in the Big 12 and ACC. And you have this huge clump of teams who are coming into the season with playoff expectations or hopes. And it's really, the best thing I think we can say about the committee. Last time I was on this in December, whenever that was, pretty sure I had pretty strong feelings about the committee and its need for more numbers and objectivity and all this other stuff. I ended up writing a piece about that in probably March, just looking at the ways we could incorporate the lessons from the BCS and the lessons from the College Football Playoff Committee and everything else. And I hope that we can figure out ways to be as objective as possible, not to fight old battles or anything, but I am curious about how the committee treats this new SEC, especially. We'll see. I don't know what to expect in that regard. All these projections we started making when we were looking at, if the 12-team playoff existed in 2014 or whatever, that was a really fun exercise. But now that we have the 12-teamer, we completely changed college football by putting all the biggest brands in 2 conferences. And so everything's completely different now.
The example, Ryan, that we'll be able to use, that I can envision using on game day this year to point out to people how the rankings versus seeding is going to work, is not last year, but the year before, when, the teams at the top would not have gotten the buys, that, TCU's in the playoff, but they would not have gotten a buy. They weren't a conference champion, and so on. That'll be the year. That will be, I can already see the graphic or me standing at the big Zotron with a pointer saying, okay, here, look, this is how, and still it's going to be confusing, but it's going to be fun. When you think about some of the games that are coming back, I think Texas A&M's pretty obvious. What else, Ryan? What else are you looking forward to that? We talk about these problems of Power 2. Is somebody going to get left in the weeds because they played in the Big 12 or ACC or whatever? But there are some things that we're going to get back, because as fans first, what we want to see, great games, a little history, a little potential for building a rivalry or rebuilding one. What game are you really looking forward to seeing that's going to be back at least occasionally with the realignment?
Oh, the game that I've never been to and has always been at the top of my list is Utah BYU.
Mhm.
I don't know that there's ever more emotion tied to a football game than that one. And I've always been, you guys know this about me, even though I grew up in the Carolinas, I've always been obsessed by what I call mountain football, right? I mean, I love D. Dallas and Air Force, right? And I loved watching, BYU back in the day because, I would watch my ACC, SEC all day on Saturday, a lot of times be at a game and, final scores 21-18 and, we've had two safeties and whatever else. And then, I turn on BYU San Diego State at midnight and I'm not going to bed till 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I've always loved the passion behind that game and talking to the people who have played in that game. I mean, but both head coaches at those schools played in that game in super intense versions of that game. And so that game coming back on the regular is a big deal. I'm fascinated by Texas A&M simply because I wrote a story a few years ago about are they ever going to play this game again? And there was a weekend where they both had home games. A&M was home on Thursday and Texas was home on Saturday. There were throwaway games, but it was opening weekend. And I found the one barbecue joint that was the geographic center. I mean, almost to the 10th of a mile between the two schools and went there on Friday and talked to a lot of fans about it. And it was interesting because the older fans were God, it has to come back. I lived for this game. And they start telling all these stories. The younger fans didn't care because – this is the part that I always talk about messing with stuff. And there's an entire generation. I mean, you could argue a generation and a half that's never seen this football game. The only thing they know about this football game is what granddad has shown them on the YouTube machine, right, in standard definition video. And so I'm really curious to see what the passion is like when these games come back. And on the flip side of that, about Oklahoma, Texas A&M, I think Oklahoma is so underappreciated and underreported in this whole thing. When I talk to my SEC people, they're obsessed with Texas and how's Texas going to fit? And I understand Texas was just in the playoff and they just played at Alabama and all that stuff. But Oklahoma's historically a much, much better program than Texas. And it is
look at the two schedules the two teams got too.
Yeah.
Oklahoma got a baptism, maybe.
But everybody's like, what's it like going to a game at Texas? It's fine, but going to a game at Oklahoma is unbelievable. Yeah. And so to me, it's the underappreciated aspect of it. And I think that, Tennessee fans experienced it going to Oklahoma not too long ago. I think that part's going to be sneaky, but to me, it's the holy war. I know we're not supposed to call it that anymore, I guess, but I can't wait to see that game on the regular because they need it, man. They live for that game up there, and I don't care if the teams are good or bad. The passion behind that thing, something I've always wanted to witness in person.
Yeah, they've played some over the years, and being in different conferences, it'll be add an element to it. Being in the same conference. I do want to say one thing, Ryan. If I misunderstood you, please correct me, but I think you made reference to the Texas A&M game being in standard definition. If you did, I'm highly offended because whenever that game comes around, I assume I won't be calling it this year. I was the play-by-play guy for the last Texas A&M game, and I can assure you right now, it was in spectacular high definition.
No.
Spectacular high definition.
I know you look like the guys on the roofs like in London in World War II, I know, here they come, and they're running the single wing, and I can hear you now. Got your fedora on and the whole
thing. Man. Yeah. Hey, that was the good old days. That's the way it should be called. I do remember that night because A&M had them, and it was what, 2011? 2011, they had them, and they also were on their way out. They were feeling good about life, but they were also in that run of time for a couple of years where they continually beat teams and lost the game. It's what ended up costing Mike Sherman his job, and it happened again against Texas. They played better almost the whole game and then found a way to lose at the end. Bill, as we're getting close to wrap time here, what do you look at in terms of your projections right now as the most fascinating thing you found, the team we should keep an eye on at least? Because as much as returning production can go in, I feel like that a lot of these coaches are finding out what college basketball coaches have embraced because they've been forced to embrace the last couple of years that each year is a brand new team. I mean, that's always the case. And Nick Saban has said many times he's always approached it that way. But there's also been a great deal of continuity in college football, generally speaking, from one year to the next, barring coaching changes and things of that nature. College basketball, by necessity, the last few years, the coaches just look, this is a one-shot deal, man. This is my team this year, and we'll see about next year later. And so as you look at this right now, what's the most compelling team that you have ranked as you look at your SP Plus ranking?
Well, I think the most compelling, just really super macro level storyline is kind of the same as last year in that we know now with the transfer portal, UConn obviously just changed their entire basketball team and won another national title. But, with football, we know that using the transfer portal heavily can help you close gaps, and you can fill holes. All those other schools that recruit like Clemson does fill holes more quickly than Clemson does now. And as we've talked about many times, but we don't know that there's still, if the end goal is winning a national title, the Georgia model is still the model. The Georgia model that was absorbed from the Alabama model and everything else. Like, just build a warship of 4- and 5-star guys. And if you can't, then do what Michigan did and get the right 4- and 5-star guys and develop guys over 2, 3, 4 years and just build a physically ridiculous football team. And that's still what wins you the title in the end. Even if, what's fun about college football is that it matters if you improve from 4-8 to 8-4. That's a humongous deal to thousands and thousands of fans. And the portal offers us all these different ways of winning 8 games or 10 games or 11 games. But the model is still the model. And I'm really curious if moving forward, what lessons do we take from that? Is it just going to be like, we're still going to do it? We're still going to use the portal 25 times a year, like Lane Kiffin, because we can't recruit like Georgia does? Or, does that gap close to the point where Georgia starts having to take on 10 transfers a year or what? I'm just really curious about those kind of dynamics. What that means for this year. I mean, the most noteworthy thing is that Georgia starts out way ahead of the pack in SP Plus, and Ohio State's really the only one close. Ohio State did take some key transfers, but those are still 2 of the 3 best recruiting teams in college football. And so I am really Ole Miss is going to be super interesting this year, simply to see how high they can rise with Lane Kiffin basically saying, culture, who needs culture? I'm just going to 25 transfers every single year. We're going to have the most talent we possibly can. And we're going to sacrifice culture to try to close that gap with Georgia. We'll see if it works at some point. It hasn't quite yet, even though it's made Ole Miss really good.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I don't know that I'd say you can sacrifice culture, but you have to develop a more transient one, or one that is more malleable. And, it brings me to this. Tham will always say on this podcast, we don't root for teams, root for stories. So in that vein, I'm rooting for the story of Clemson. I'm sick to death of the Dabo blasphemy. I've had it. I mean, all these people, you've got to use the portal. You know what? The guy has won 2 national championships and played for 2 more. If he thinks it can work this way, why would we just automatically assume that because they've had a couple of, by Clemson standards, recent Clemson standards, by all-time Clemson standards, they haven't had down years. By recent Clemson standards, they've had a couple of, not as championship caliber years. I'm rooting for that story, not because I'm against the portal. The way Lane's doing it, go for it. No problem. No problem at all. Dabo's trying to do it his way. Good for him. Go ahead. I hope Clemson is really, really good this year. Not rooting for the team, rooting for that story because of that.
I think I'm really curious about, Clemson's really interesting because they're not bad. Like you said, basically, I think with the way Davis, when he currently runs his roster, he's not going to win another national title. It's just, he's not going to produce like a top 2 or 3 team.
Mark that down.
That's fine. That's fine.
I really, and I'm not saying you're wrong, but man, I wouldn't like to come back on this podcast and tell you we're wrong about that. I would love it. I would love doing it.
I have no problem being wrong. I've been doing this long enough to have been wrong about everything at least once. And so, that kind of frees you to say what you want to say. And I just don't think when everybody else is because their whole thing was they weren't ever signing like top 1 or 2 recruiting classes. They were signing the right 4 or 5-star guys and then using culture to get and development to get the rest of the way. And by culture, I have always tried to define it as basically like when you've got upperclassmen serving as coaches when the coaches aren't around. That's my definition of culture.
I was going to say that earlier was the last big interview I did with Nick Saban down in Tuscaloosa 2 weeks before he retired. And we didn't know he was going to do it. But what he talked about Jermaine Burton, and he talked about Kool-Aid McKinstry, and he talked about Malachi Moore, and he talked about those guys. And that's, I'm curious to see with all of the rulings and all that we had last week, and we agree that amateurism is dead, as Pete keeps reminding us that, but I'm curious to see if it comes back around for Clemson, because if we're in a world where contracts are signed, and we're in a world where guys can't walk out the door as quickly as they are doing it right now,
right,
then maybe it leans back into the guys staying for 3 and 4, in some cases 5 years, because that's the model. And you're exactly right. To me, that's all culture is. All culture is in basketball, I got 10 guys. I could turn that room pretty quick if I'm pretty good as a coach. When I got 100 guys, then I need help. And that's why my coaching staff is so big. But the coaching staff can only do so much. So it's about those older guys that are in the room. But, yeah, and by the way, Bill, I live about 1 mile north of the South Carolina border. I can already hear the mobs are headed to my house. Is that guy in your house, the guy that just said that? They're all wearing orange.
Hey, now let me point out something here, too. Now, because I'm defending Dabo and his approach, I do not think, and I do think sometimes he is predisposed to digging his heels in for the sake of digging his heels in.
Yeah.
Should not do that. I'm not saying they should never take a transfer. I'm not saying he shouldn't look to the portal. In fact, I think he should. But I think this whole idea that the game has passed him by and he doesn't know what he's doing and all of this stuff is that's what has gotten under my skin about it. It's not now. If he's going to dig in and say, well, I'm going to develop that 218-pound tackle. I'm going to make him a 270-pound tackle over 3 years. And I'm not taking, All-American X from wherever that wants to come to Clemson. I don't think he's doing that. But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about, stubbornly digging your heels in for the sake of doing it. I'm talking about feeling like I've got to replace everybody. I can't trust Hunter Renfrow because he was a 0-star and he weighed 135 pounds when he came on campus. I've got to go get an Ohio State transfer that didn't play as much. That's what I'm talking about. But it'll be a pretty fascinating thing to watch for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's I'm definitely not saying Dabo should go out and start signing 20 transfers, but I think he is being overly stubborn by not taking like the 4 biggest holes on the roster and bringing in 4 guys to fill those holes and leaning on upperclassmen and development and everything for everything else. Because again, like if you're signing top 15 classes, even with that awesome development and everything else, you're still gonna need a little boost to get ahead of all the other teams signing top 10 or 15 classes, and he doesn't have that right now. Yeah, if we go back around to signing contracts and guys staying 2-3 years or whatever, he's set. Like he's right back in his environment, and he could move right back up. But right now, in this environment, he's not going to win a national title.
But he also knows his constituency, and these are my people. And so, nobody circles the wagons like upstate South Carolina, right? And so, I mean, I always
upstate New York with the Buffalo Bills.
I knew you were going to go there, but the reality is that, I mean, I remember a million years ago, Sports Illustrated wrote a great profile of Clemson, because back then Danny Ford's there. They're winning 9-10 games a year. They're playing on New Year's Day every day. They got a national championship, and the whole Open. I can't remember who wrote it now, but the whole Open was about this charming little cow town, and upstate. They're still mad about that story. That story was 30 years ago. And so Dabo knows his people. They don't get us, y'all. They don't get how we do things in Clemson, South Carolina. That's it. That's it. No,
We're
he
on
knows
the Roy bus. The rest of y'all, ROY. The rest
it's
of
the
y'all.
Wendy
bus.
Peppercorn rule, right? She don't know what she's doing. Yeah, she does. She knows exactly what she's doing.
Boys, this was fun as we close this edition of the College Game Day podcast. I do, and I'm sure that those of you watching and listening have seen countless tributes to the great Bill Walton over the last couple of days. Bill was a friend. Bill was a football fan. Bill was one of the great guest pickers in the history of College Game Day. And when we asked him in 2021 to come be the guest picker, he had a major schedule conflict. He was in Houston for something, some other personal business, and then he was going to go watch Luke, his son, coach. But he said, I would love to do it if I can. We were eventually able to work out the logistics. He came, as he always does. He always did. He was sensational, though I'm still not sure that Corso or Herb Street had a single clue as to what he was saying the entire time. But it was tremendous. I mean, it was just a highlight of the show. He was always funny and engaging, and this persona that he created in the years after his playing career was one to behold. But in that episode, and let me say at the beginning, I'm a casual Grateful Dead fan, which would have made Bill write me off. But I'd done a little homework before the show because I wanted to throw some references in just to see what reaction I would get from Bill. So we did, and there were a couple of good moments from it. And a few days after I'm going to read a text to you. A few days after the show, I got a text from Bill. And Bill said, my deepest apologies. Recently, when I was on your show, you made a beautiful, graceful, and deft Grateful Dead reference, and I butchered it by misidentifying the song. I goofed by saying Althea when I should have said help is on the way or help on the way, which is what I really need. I'm so sorry. I beg your forgiveness and that of the rest of the known universe as well. I'm sorry. I hope we can still be friends. Thank you for my life, BW. I mean, if that doesn't epitomize Walton, I don't know what does, man. I mean, there was a mischievousness to it. There was a messing with you quality to those notes that you'd get from him, but there was an underlying sincerity too. He was one of one, man, and we'll miss him. He was a great football fan. His brother, Bruce, was a terrific player at UCLA and for the Dallas Cowboys. So he knew ball, and our condolences to his wife, Lori, his sons, and everybody who were great friends with him. We lost a great one and one of the great celebrity guest pickers of all time in the legendary Bill Walton. We appreciate you listening. This has been the College Game Day podcast. We encourage you to download it wherever you prefer to get your podcast, or better yet, subscribe.